Aw, squish.
Welcome back to the channel, and on today's episode we're going to be doing lowering springs and front brakes on my wife's 2018 Mazda 3 hatchback.
Here we have the EBC brake pads, brake rotors, and Eibach lowering springs. The brake rotors are very specific to the car, so make sure that you get the correct ones for your build location. Remove the wheel. Remove the hub-centric ring. Remove brake line clip and set brake line to the side. Removing the sway bar end link is quite easy. Just don't strip out the Allen key that is in the center. If you do have an issue, I do have a workaround later in the video showing it in the rear suspension. I found it easier to remove the ABS wiring from the clip rather than the clip from the strut brace. The rear strut brace clip is way easier to get. Loosen both caliper bolts and remove the bottom one. Now with zip tie handy, remove the upper caliper bolt, slide it into the upper caliper bolt hole, and get it affixed to the hard brake line. Removing the front brake pads is not necessary to do the lowering springs, but since they were trashed, I need to replace them anyways. Make sure you check out my other video for the installation of the brake pads and rotors. Remove the outer tie rod end, making sure to use quite a bit of penetrating oil and do not damage the threads on the outer tie rod end. Remove both nuts from the two lower strut bolts. I like to make sure that I have a good grip of the spindle before I remove both of the bolts to ensure that I do not damage anything. Since I'm working on a lift, I need to lower the vehicle so I can access the upper strut mount bolts. Remove all the strut mount nuts besides the one. I like to keep the outer one on. Now with a good grip on the strut, I can remove the last nut, then remove the strut from the vehicle. These are external spring compressors. You use these because any other way is actually quite dangerous. If I were to have an issue with the external spring compressors wanting to move down the coil, then I would grab a pair of vice grips and lock them onto the coil. This would damage the coil slightly, but it is safe. Always make sure to mark the strut for removal because the top bearing needs to be set into the same exact position. When using external spring compressors, I make sure to flip-flop between the two, ensuring that I am compressing the coil spring evenly. I am then able to remove the center nut of the strut mount, ensuring that the coil spring is compressed enough that I am able to remove it without the top mount just popping off. Eibach is nice enough to provide a new bump stop. Simply slip the bump stop into the bellow. Eibach coil springs are on the left, stock are on the right. Use the external spring compressor to tighten down the new Eibach coil springs. Install the lower insulator. I make sure that it hooks perfectly into the bottom side of the coil spring, and then there are two tabs that line up perfectly on the strut. I then install the top cap and bearing and make sure that everything is lined up perfectly before installing the nut. Here is a close-up of the top cap. There is a Torx key that fits into the center, and then the outside is a 17mm. Once I get this tightened down, I will then hit it with an impact driver to make sure that it is seated properly. With everything lined up correctly, I am then able to remove the external spring compressors. I keep one nut handy and then install the strut. I look in from the bottom and I'm able to see the holes, able to line up everything properly. Then install the nut and it will hold the strut in place. Lift up the strut with one hand and then tighten down the nuts with the other. I always install the nuts by hand before torquing them down with an impact. Now I'm able to raise the vehicle back up to access the suspension components. Getting the knuckle lined up is never an easy task, ensuring that I have a bolt in my hand so whenever I do get it lined up properly, I can just simply slide it through and then it will hold itself in place. Then install the second bolt and nuts onto it by hand before torquing it down with an impact. Clean the mating surface for the sway bar end link, then install it. Reinstall the piece that is supposed to help with vibration noise and then thread the nut on by hand before tightening it down with the Allen key in the center and a 14mm wrench. Again, if there is an issue with this Allen being stripped out later on in the video, I have a workaround, so make sure you check out the rear suspension installation. Reinstall the brake caliper onto the bracket and then make sure to tighten down the bolts by hand before tightening them down with a wrench or an impact. As you can see, there are new EBC brake pads and rotors on here. Make sure you check out my other video for a very detailed description on how I installed them. There is also a break-in period for these brakes and I talk about that, and also the comparison of the factory brakes versus the EBC brakes. I then reinstall the brake line and clip. Clean the mating surface for the outer tie rod end, making sure that the hole is nice and clean, and then reinstall the outer tie rod end into the knuckle. Always threading the nut on by hand before tightening it down with an impact. Reinstall the clip. Now I've moved on to the rear of the vehicle, removing the tire so I can access the outer bolt for the lower control arm. The rear sway bar end links are never fun to get off. There's an Allen in the center and then a 14mm on the outside. Now the driver's side did strip out on me, and the way that I was able to get that off is by taking a pair of vice grips and locking it onto the back side, making sure that I am not locking it onto the boot and potentially damaging it and allowing grease to leak out, but locking it onto the flared portion. Here you can see the nut that is locked into the control arm, so there is no need to use a wrench. Simply remove the bolt while supporting the lower control arm. Then I am able to lower the screw jack down and then be able to pull out the coil spring. I always make sure to clean the lower and upper insulator and the lower control arm before reinstalling the coil spring. Now that everything is cleaned up, I then reinstall the lower insulator. It can only go one way because the lower control arm is notched to accommodate the coil spring. Using a screw jack, I then compress the coil spring upward until I can get the bolt holes lined up for the lower control arm. I do not tighten down the nut all the way. With the sway bar end link still disconnected, I then load the suspension to curb weight. You can see that the lift is no longer supporting that one corner, then tighten the bolt all the way down before removing the support. Reinstall the sway bar end link. I always mark all the nuts and bolts that I have loosened or taken off with a paint pen. This takes the guesswork out of the job very quickly. So once I see that there is a paint mark on it, I know that it has been tightened and torqued to specification. Now I am able to clean up the mating surfaces for the brakes, then install my hub-centric ring, and then get the wheel installed. Always threading the lug nuts on by hand before hitting them with the impact and then torquing them down to specification.
I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Make sure you hit me up in the comments. We'll see y'all next time.